Celeste here. And we're on page 487.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk about the economy of Japan. It's so cool to talk about it. Do any of you know anything about Japan?
No.
Other than that they bombed Pearl Harbor? It wasn't all the Japanese people did it, just it was some military people. Anybody know anything else? Say yes, that's where one of our presidents, the one from right here in town, Harry Truman, dropped the atomic bomb.
Yeah. And they thought that they had the most, like, the best security of, like, the air ever.
Yeah.
But the planes couldn't get over there, but that was not good.
That must have been a tough decision, to make a decision like that, to, gotcha Carla, to bomb Japan. Because if any of you have read any history of, we're on page 486, talking a little bit about the economy of Japan. And I was just talking about most of what we know about Japan is Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. We got involved in a war and realized that it was going to cost so many lives. They decided to drop the atomic bomb in Japan, and a whole bunch of Christians in Japan died as a result of that. And it was a tragedy. But it ended the war, and the guys who count numbers say, and it saved a lot of lives,
But it
more
also
lives
stole a
than
lot.
died over the long haul, if the war would have been protracted. But we felt so bad about what we did that we went to Japan and helped them rebuild their economy. And guess what happened? We're on page 486 talking about the Japanese economy. And guess what happened? We helped them rebuild after we devastated them. And Japan has become, you saw the picture, didn't you, in the book earlier? Japan is one of the strongest economic countries on the planet. And where do we get our favorite cars here in America? From Japan. Why? They run longer, they're more dependable. I mean, you get a Toyota and it's going to last you a long time. And it comes from Japan. And in fact, this is kind of an interesting sidelight. Japan really put America's car industry to shame and put them out of business pretty much. But there was a man who went to Detroit to show people in Detroit how to build a better car and how to have better quality control so you wouldn't have so many lemons coming off of the production line. And the guys in Detroit weren't interested. So this scientist took his knowledge to Japan and helped them put together their auto manufacturing business, and look what happened. Became one of the strongest in the world. And Japan became one of the strongest economies. And is it okay to say this? One of our best friends in terms of powers around the globe. So on page 488, it starts talking about political economies. Do you know what they mean by a political economy? What's the political economy in America? What part of our system is nationalized?
Hmm?
What part of our economy is nationalized?
Like our business?
Okay, is the military nationalized? The government controls the military and they pay the bills? Is anything else nationalized?
I mean, don't we do a lot of trading with other countries?
Okay, but maybe a lot of that trade is done by private companies. not so much by the government. Can you think of anything else that goes on in America that's nationalized? Do any of you have any relatives who collect Social Security? Do they collect that from a private company or from the government? So Social Security is nationalized. Do any of you know someone who, a single mother trying to raise 3 children, and she doesn't even have a high school diploma, and she has a hard time getting a good paying job, and so she needs help to feed her children, and she gets money every month? Does it come from some private company or from the government? So we've nationalized a food service for children who live in poverty. You follow what I'm talking about? That we have some nationalized things, but most of what we do here is capitalized. I mean, who owns all the oil in America? The major oil companies. Who owns all the oil in Russia? Okay, it used to be the Russian government. Were you around when the wall came down in Germany? You guys missed out on all that exciting stuff. I'm watching TV and they're tearing that wall down and people are driving through. It was just amazing. It was amazing. I'm saying we're seeing history in the making here.
What year was that?
What year was that? Was it 20 years ago?
When what?
We could probably see a video of it.
Yeah, we probably could if we had time.
We have time.
No, we don't. We have a whole bunch of material to cover here on past the economic growth. Russia owned all the oil. Then when the wall came down, capitalism, Russia said, when the wall came down because the Russian economy collapsed. When the Russian economy collapsed, people in Russia said, we ought to borrow ideas from America. And they borrowed a lot of capitalistic ideas. Here's the difference. Capitalism in America is regulated by certain laws and rules of doing business, honesty kind of thing. Capitalism in Russia is not capitalism like it is in America. Capitalism in Russia is a few friends of people in political power buying things for way too cheap a price and selling it for an inflated price to the rest of the world. They're called oligarchs. And now the oil companies in Russia are in the hands of oligarchs. But one oligarch, who was a wealthy oil man, was too critical of Putin, and so guess what happened? He went to prison, and the government confiscated his oil company and said that he had actually acquired this company illegally. In Venezuela, where they're having all kinds of, have you heard about what's going on in Venezuela? In Venezuela, it's been in the news that Maduro is having a difficult time because there's no food, it's just the economy's collapsed there. Okay, when Venezuela was a friend to America, American oil people went to Venezuela to help them develop their oil industry. But in the process of developing it, it was done by private companies, so the private companies got a share of the oil. When a socialist took over in Venezuela, he said, the Americans are taking all of our money, so we're going to nationalize all the oil companies and take them all back and run them ourselves and cut the American capitalist out of the picture. Any idea what happened when they cut the American capitalist out of their oil producing picture?
We went downhill.
Because they didn't know how to produce the oil. They thought they could do it and it didn't work. And so now their oil production is almost nothing. And their whole economy is falling apart. And probably what will happen, it'll take a while and some painful stuff in Venezuela, but probably what will happen is that they'll come back around to embrace more of not so much capitalism, but they will say, will the oil companies please come back and help us restore our oil industry? And they'll say yes for a price, and they'll make them pay for it, and they'll go back and help them build it again. So nationalizing and nationalism, nationalized system and capitalistic system, and then it talks about laissez-faire capitalism, which is just leave things alone and let them go wherever they go. But in America, if you let every capitalist banker do as he wants with other people's money, what will some of them do? Steal the money and take advantage of people. So guess what we have? We have a government department called the if you put money in the bank, it'll say FDIC insured, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The government says we regulate banks, we inspect banks, and if a bank takes your money and then steals it from you, we will promise to reimburse you, and we'll take the banker and put him in jail. So we have a lot of government involvement in capitalism in America. It isn't like it's either socialism or capitalism. It's kind of a mixture of both. And other countries around the world, they'll embrace a capitalistic approach for a while when they're friendly toward us, and then they don't like us anymore, and so they embrace a more socialistic approach like Cuba did, like Venezuela did, like Russia did when the wall came down. And you have to, and listen, give the Russian people credit for this. When the wall came down, they were asking Americans to come and help them build their country and make it strong, since we have a strong country. And capitalists went over there and taught them how to do it, but they didn't have the legal system in place to control it, nor did they have the moral money managers in place to manage it well. Because part of the thinking in socialistic circles, I try to do research on socialistic countries where the government owns everything. And I've concluded that in a socialistic country, there are really three classes of people: the ruling class, the working class, and the warring class. They want a strong army to defend their country, as well as in Venezuela right now, the president of Venezuela is in hiding because he's afraid to come out, because the whole nation is mad at him for the way he's destroyed the country. But the military is still on his side because he pays them well. So he wants a military to keep his people under control. But he wants all those people working to make money for the nation, so he has money to spend on a national level. So socialism, but who gets all the benefits? Who lives like rich people in a socialistic country? The people who are in power in the socialistic country. It's kind of like some of the people in Washington. It's like we don't really work for a living, we just run the country. That's why we should be paid well. It's like, no, you should be paid to make sure that the rest of us are allowed to run our country in a way that makes it the safest, the best, and the most productive. Well, no, we've got the best idea on what would make this country great. We already have a great country. We just need you to quit messing with it. Although there are a few things that need to be addressed, and I guess this would be, again, what's been nationalized in America? Education, called public school. But you know why education isn't completely nationalized? When the public schools were doing a great job, everybody went to public schools. When the public schools stopped doing a good job, what happens? Does anyone know what happens? Private schools open up. So that people go to private schools or homeschool. They just take their kids out of school and keep them at home. It says on page 489, the results of privatization. If a country privatizes some of its assets, it must devise a policy for investing the windfall of money that it receives. if Venezuela is going to sell their oil assets to capitalists from America, they're going to make a lot of money on it, just like the oil companies are going to make money, but they need to figure out where to put that money to make sure that they're going to have money to take care of their citizens down the road. And a lot of countries that privatize some of their stuff, the end result is that the people who ended up buying it became very, very rich, and the country benefited very little from it. In Russia, they have natural gas reserves more than anybody else in the world, and so they use natural gas to provide nationalized heat to all of the buildings all over, to all the people in Russia. I mean, they pay for it, but the price is so small. It's like saying people pay for bread when the government subsidizes the cost of making bread and distributing it. Page 492 talks about national transportation infrastructure. What's the national transportation infrastructure in America? We're talking about the economy here. So we're talking about goods and services, probably especially goods. How do all the things that you buy at Walmart get to Walmart? Trucks. And how do those trucks, okay, so you see a truck going down the road with, have you seen pictures of shipping containers coming here from China? Huge big things.
Yeah.
Okay, those shipping containers land at one of our ports. They pull those containers off, and one container is equivalent to a big semi-trailer truck. They pull those off and put them on these little wheels, sets of wheels, and a guy hooks up to it and pulls it from New Orleans up here to Kansas City to deliver stuff to a Walmart distribution center that puts it in other trucks to deliver it to all the Walmart stores. So our highway system, what do we call our highway system here in America? What 71 highway is now called what? I-49? When you leave Kansas City to go home, which interstate do you drive on?
49
I-49?
and 71.
I-35? I-70? I. They're all interstate. It's a huge interstate highway system. Have any of you lived someplace where you used to drive on roads before there was an interstate highway? 71 highway? Before there was an interstate? Went through all these little towns with stoplights, stop and go driving. And now you just get on I-49 and shoo, breeze right through town or around town or whatever. We've got this interstate system all across America that we use to transport goods. But have you ever seen, how do they get coal down to the Hawthorne power plant to provide electricity for us? It comes by railroad car. Have you ever seen a train going by with a whole bunch of those shipping containers on it? So we use rail, we use trucks. Do we fly some stuff around? Does some stuff come in by airplane? So we use airlines. Have any of you been to Europe to know that you don't need to own a car? Everybody's within walking distance of a train station. It's amazing. You can. I went to Europe one time to visit a bunch of Calvary graduates who were missionaries, and I bought a pass to ride European trains in about 7 different countries. And I just walked up to the train, showed my pass, got on the train, went to the next town, went to the next country, got off and went to see the missionary and got back on, and I paid one price. When I left America, I think I paid $400 to ride trains for 2 months all over Europe, unlimited travel. It was like, whoa. And I thought, Europe uses trains for everything to the point where you don't even have to have a car. And so their infrastructure is filled up with rail lines so they don't have to have as many cars in their country. In our country, there's a railroad track that goes across the road where we come to school, but it's been covered with blacktop because we don't use that anymore. When railroad tracks quit being used, they sometimes pull up the metal and recycle it. But we have just gone to trucks and airplanes as our transportation infrastructure. This morning when I came to school, there was a big truck coming up the hill with one of those great big containers on it. I'm going, where would they get that container down what used to be the airport? Oh, does anyone know what happened to that old airport? Trains come through there from Mexico and Canada and bring these great big shipping containers full of stuff that some of it stops here in Kansas City and is shipped to other places, and some of it goes on to Canada and some of it goes on to Mexico, and some containers are brought here and shipped both directions. So we still do use train travel a lot. What happens to a country that doesn't have an infrastructure to move their goods and services around? They're just not going to experience the kind of economic growth. So on page 495, it shows India expanding their road network. And China is expanding their railroad network. I think, have any of you heard about the Silk Road in history class? Did you remember reading about that old caravan where they had camels that carried stuff down the Silk Road? Well, apparently a few years ago, China decided that we're going to reestablish the Silk Road, but we're going to do it with railroad cars. So we're going to lay railroad track where the old Silk Road used to be and start shipping all these goods that we ship in containers through boats to the United States. We're going to start shipping it to Europe by rail. And I think it was a couple of years ago, the first train from China arrived in Britain, and it was a huge, big thing because it was going to help the economy of Britain and help the economy of China and all the economies in between who are involved in shipping the stuff. On page 496, it shows railroads in Africa. So what does that tell you? That they're using train travel in Africa as their pathway to economic growth. But in some places, those were railroads that were built back in colonial times, and to this day they're still being used and they haven't been very well maintained. So things can break down a lot. And you can see from looking at the map on page 496, Algeria, Libya, Chad, Niger, Mali, they do not have major railroads. And what does that tell you? That they're probably not enjoying the economic prosperity that other countries are. On page 498, it talks about national trade policies, where countries decide to trade with each other. Okay, the latest thing in the news. Have you heard that we not only have sent some aircraft carriers and some battleships to the Middle East because Iran is making noises like they're going to attack some American interest over there, and the noise is such that we even dispatched some bombers from out at Whiteman to fly over there to protect our interests in that part of the world. And I thought, why would Iran be making noise about causing harm to American interests in the Middle East? Does anyone know what our current president just did in terms of relationships with Iran? He said a lot of the military equipment that was used to kill Americans in Iraq was sold to those terrorists by Iran. So, in order to punish Iran, he is telling people to no longer buy oil from Iran, and he's put a boycott on Iranian oil and telling all of our friendly nations to not do the same thing. Don't do business with them because they're harboring terrorists and they're promoting terrorism around the world. And oil is the lifeblood of Iran's economy, so they're all worked up about it. So they're going to teach the president a lesson by, apparently from what's going on, punishing America somehow. And they don't say exactly how, but see, it used to be we were one of the primary users of Iranian oil. That was when they had a leader in Iran who was friendly to America. Then when he was deposed and a socialist took over, he started selling the oil to other countries. Well, we don't care who you sell your oil to. That's free enterprise in the world. But if you sell the oil so you can use the money to support terrorism, that's a different story, especially if you're attacking American embassies and American interest in the world. So we have trade policies. Does this surprise you? Because of the way the current Venezuelan president has talked about America, we have boycotted some business with them. And again, they reach out to Russia and China to get help. Page 499 shows China's booming coastal provinces, how trade policies can affect the national distribution of wealth. Because China builds a lot of things that are sold around the world, does it make sense to you that since it leaves China by ship, that most of the prosperity is going to be along the coastline? Page 500 shows a picture of prosperity in Mexico. You go, I thought Mexicans were coming to America to work because Mexico is a poor country. What's the title on the picture on page 500?
Tourism.
Tourism. Did you know that some places in the world, they have taken poor countries and said, your country is so beautiful, and there are so many people in Europe and in Britain and in America that would love to come here as a tourist. If you will build some tourist facilities and show off all of this beauty, you'll get a ton of money from tourism, and you can use it to improve the quality of life in your little country. When I was in Greece, visiting my son-in-law's family, I got a motorbike and rode up into the hills and saw these old fields where terraces had been built, where farmers used to work, and it was just all grown over with grass. And when I was in town, I said to one of the guys, a merchant in a store, I said, why don't they raise crops? Why aren't people farming on these little farms anymore? And he said, there's no need to. I said, well, what do people do for a living? He said, a farmer who used to work all year making a meager living raising crops can now come down to the seashore and work in a tourist trap, a tourist shop, and make enough money in 3 months to live better than a farmer could live all year. So they just walk away from it, and tourism becomes an industry in the Greek islands too. And if you go some of these places where you'll see all this tourism and you look at it, well, just get on the internet and look at places to go as a tourist, and you'll see some beautiful places that you say, wow, that would be fun to go there. And then check out what the prices are to go there, and you can see where it can be pretty expensive. But it's a business, it becomes a pathway to economic growth for some countries just to market tourism. On page 503, it shows a picture of the formation of the global economy. Basically, world trade. And can you see how these arrows are drawn? Where merchandise flows from, well, coming to America. It's kind of a circle between North America, between the United States and Canada, coming from Europe to America. And where's that coming from off on the other direction to America?
Asia.
From Asia, from China, and you see over here, Asia circles around, and the dark lines are the heaviest amount of merchandise trade, and then the lighter lines are the lesser amount. But it all has to do with a global economy, where basically, if you want to know something about the global economy, just go home and pull up the labels in your clothing and see all the places where it comes from. Go to a store and walk around and look at the tags on merchandise to see where it came from, and you'll be amazed. Page 504 talks about the world's largest corporations. Where are the largest? The corporations with the greatest revenue. Saudi Arabia. What is Saudi Arabia selling? Fruits and vegetables that they raise in the desert? Anyone know what Saudi Arabia is selling? Oil. Anyone know what they do with that money that they make from selling oil? Well, part of it they build hotels for tourists. Part of it they reinvest and buy buildings in New York City in America. Anyone know what the Royal Dutch Shell Company is?
Yes.
They sell seashells. They sell bullets for guns. No, guess what Royal Dutch is? It's an oil company. Guess what Exxon Mobil is?
Oil.
An oil company. Guess what Walmart is? Isn't that something that Walmart's right there? Are there Walmarts in other countries?
Not a lot.
Have any of you been to lived in a little town where a Walmart store didn't move to town, but they built a big store right outside of town, so it would be convenient for all the people who live around there in like a 10-mile circle to come to the store? Clinton, Missouri is one. They built a big Walmart in Clinton, Missouri, and all the little Main Street stores downtown closed. And some people were upset about it. And I was in Clinton one time. I was shopping at the Walmart and talking to the guy in the hardware department. And I said, "Boy, you sure know your stuff." And he said, "Well, I ought to." He said, "I used to run a hardware store downtown for 40 years. And I'm going, "Oh, wow." I said, "That must be I thought it must have been a sad day to close up your store," because I read about what happened in Clinton, to close up your store because Walmart put you out of business. And he smiled. And I said, "It wasn't a sad day?" He said, "All my life, I've had to keep all those books and take care of all the overhead and do all that stuff. And now I just walk in here and work in the hardware department and let somebody else take care of all that stuff." And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. That this guy who was put out of business by Walmart works for Walmart and loves the arrangement. But that was a number of years ago when I was talking to the guy in the hardware department at Walmart. He's probably retired now because he was old then. But if you go back to the Walmart in Clinton and go looking for the hardware department, there is no hardware department. There's light bulbs and tools and paint. You understand what I'm talking about? The hardware department is gone. You, Sam Walton, would just be so worked up about this that his kids who took over his business have decided that keeping all those nuts and bolts and things around to accommodate all the people who need that stuff, and washers and screws and nails, it's just too much. It's too much overhead. It's too much inventory. It's too expensive. You can make more money selling other stuff. So move that stuff out and put in stuff that turns over quickly and makes more money.
It's also partly because they have a partnership deal with Lowe's.
And isn't that interesting? You see a Walmart, and what do you see on the same little close by?
Lowe's.
Across the street, a Lowe's, where Lowe's says we'll take care of all that stuff. So I go into Lowe's and I'm saying, okay, I'm looking for the hardware department. Now they've got all the nuts and bolts that I used to buy at the little hardware, but I could go to the hardware and buy them individually, just as many as I needed. What do I have to do at Lowe's? Buy a sack of them. Buy a box of them. I've got so many sacks and boxes of stuff around my house because I had to buy the whole sack. But it's like, okay, so Walmart and Lowe's have pretty well taken over. And it used to be Walmart didn't sell groceries. And now they've got a grocery section. And say what you want about it. I said to my wife, you know, I like shopping at Price Chopper and Hy-Vee, but nobody beats Walmart's price for whole milk. I just bought some yesterday. It was $2.69 a gallon. And that same whole milk is $3.99 a gallon at Hy-Vee and Walmart. And I think it's $3 at Aldi's. And it's like, wow, they've got the best price on milk. And then Nina said, yeah, but some of that Walmart milk went blinky on me. Anyone know what it means by blinky?
Bad.
When you drink it, it makes you blink because it tastes sour. That's why it's called blinky. And so I said, okay, I'll start buying it at Aldi's and Hy-Vee. And then we got some Hy-Vee milk that went blinky, and I said, it must not be Walmart. If we're paying an extra $1 to get it at Hy-Vee and it still goes blinky, then let's go back to Walmart. She said, okay, we'll do that. So I go into Walmart. And what I like about buying milk at Walmart is right in the section where the milk is where they have the reduced bakery stuff. And sometimes I buy a box of donuts that neither my wife or I need for about, what, 10 or 15 cents a donut? Yeah, good stuff. Oh, okay, let's get back to this stuff here. Multinational corporations challenge individual nations to regulate them or to tax them. And if you raise taxes too much on a big multinational corporation, they'll just pick up and move their headquarters someplace else where they're more tax friendly. And that's, by the way, some countries, their path to economic growth has been to say, we don't charge taxes for you to live here. Just bring your corporation here and we'll become your corporate headquarters and we'll benefit from all of your people living here doing business. So that becomes their path to economic growth. Page 507 talks about FDI, foreign direct investment. And does this surprise you? Because America is so rich and has such a booming economy, a lot of foreign countries invest money in America. Okay, if you were a rich oligarch in Russia who acquired your wealth a little bit dishonestly, and you knew that they could elect a new president who didn't like you and could take your wealth away, what would be a wise thing to do with your wealth before somebody takes it? Invest it in America. And a whole bunch of those oligarchs did that in Russia. And guess what? Because Russia has not been very friendly to our president has said, we're going to make it difficult for oligarchs to make money through foreign direct investment. By simply saying, if you interfered in our elections or if you financed people who are doing things to mess with our country, then we're going to confiscate your property and dispose of it, just like they do people who sell drugs in America. You're driving a great big fancy car and the trunk's full of drugs, and when they stop you and arrest you, what do? They take your car and sell it and keep the money. So foreign direct investment, it's a two-sided thing. Foreign countries that are unstable want to direct invest money in America where there's stability. But if America and the foreign country get on at odds with each other, then it can create some dissonance, I guess you would call it, some arguments about how to handle things. Page 511, talks about the rise of BRIC. What is BRIC? The 7 leaders of France, United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan began meeting annually in the mid-1970s to discuss the oil crisis and the recession at that time. You didn't know there was an oil crisis in the 1970s? There was a gas shortage and gasoline went up to about $5 a gallon. The G7 continued to meet annually to discuss economic growth, trade, and finance. And then when Russia joined, it was called the G8. At first, the G20 was just a meeting of finance ministers from Argentina, Austria, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South America, South Korea, Turkey, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union. So what's going on here? Where's BRIC? Oh, right-hand column on page 511. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. See that? BRIC are already part of the G20, and Russia also sits on the G8. The BRIC are not organized in any formal way. They share certain concerns that they'll bring to bear on discussions in both G20 and G8 meetings. And they're concerns that have to do with Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And that's why they're called BRICS. So you understand there are all these national meetings going on where they talk about business and how to improve the quality of business relationships in the world, how to improve countries' economies, and how to do business with each other in a way that will keep everybody happy. Well, it looks like we're ready for chapter 13. What does page 515 say? Chapter 13 is all about global challenges and the scale of responses. I think my question on Canvas for chapter 13 was, what global challenges do you think we're facing in the world today? And I read things like, what were some of the things that people have posted?
Human trafficking.
Human trafficking, pollution, global warming, global hunger, and all of those. All of those are issues, and they talk about some of it here in this chapter. But probably the best thing you can do is just do some research and reading and inform yourself as to what's going on in these areas. The one area that I don't think anybody has mentioned yet has to do with the spiritual dimension. You go, what?
Wait, what?
What challenges are facing the globe from a spiritual dynamic, from a spiritual dimension?
Say it louder.
I don't know if it's right.
It is right.
What?
Persecution?
What?
Persecution?
Are Christians being persecuted around the world? Is our country doing anything about that?
No.
Why not? What countries would be persecuting Christians?
China.
North Korea.
The church in China is called an underground church. North Korea. Islamic countries. Some Islamic countries
Even
are
Israel.
what you would call moderate Islamic countries who don't persecute Christians. And other countries have a national policy that says, if you're a Christian when you come here, okay, but if you try to proselytize somebody else to be a Christian, you can be in serious trouble.
Yeah, you can't let anyone know you're a Christian in Israel either.
I had a friend who went to Saudi Arabia to teach engineering in a university. And he could go to a church in town because there was a church, because there's enough expats, they call them, people who are not Saudi, who come there to work, who want to go to church, but if he in his university classroom talked about the church he attended, he could be in trouble because they didn't want him doing that. Can a professor in America talk about the church he goes to? He has the right to, but if he does talk about it too much, could he possibly get in trouble with somebody at the university? Can you be so liberal in your economic policy or your social policy that the university will say you can't work here anymore? Can you be so conservative in your economic or social policy that they say you can't work here anymore? Have any of you gone to a secular college or university
Yes.
where they've had discussions in a classroom about economic and social policies? And what happened when someone from a conservative standpoint spoke up?
They're ridiculed.
That's exactly what happened to my grandson. And it backfired on the guy who was teaching the class because he played baseball and he was a good pitcher on their team, and the other kids at school knew him, and they said it's not fair for this professor to be picking on one of our baseball players. So did that professor lose his job? No, he was just told to tone it down a little bit. And then guess what they called my grandson and told him to do? That's exactly right, Anna. Tone it down a little bit. And my grandson said, all I did was answer his question when he asked me what I thought about it, because the guy knew what he believed, so he was kind of setting him up to think he could tear him down. But he went to a church where the pastor taught them how to handle some of this stuff because he had been at a secular university where they did that stuff. And I think the anti-Christian sentiment around the world is a global challenge that we Christians face.
It's funny how people are allowed to persecute us, but the moment we say we don't like something or this is wrong, we are ridiculed and we are the ones put
It's
down.
almost like it's okay to ridicule Christians, but Christians better not ridicule anybody else.
Yeah,
And
and
it's just
it's
like,
the Bible said it was going to happen, but it's still like
yeah,
it's
that's
so
right,
good.
and I think that's it. You say, we shouldn't be surprised by it because the Bible says it's going to happen. It used to be that America and England sent out more missionaries around the world than any other country. Does anyone know what country is sending out the most missionaries today?
Isn't it
What?
like Northern Africa,
That's exactly right.
Eastern Europe,
Isn't that something?
Western Europe? I mean?
Yeah, that it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Have we lost sight of what it means to take the gospel to the unreached people of the world? Are we so caught up in business and pleasure and tourism and stuff that we've lost sight of that? So I think there is a spiritual dimension that, and the challenge is to represent Christianity well in this country, to not let all the grief wear us down. And I know this is hard, but doesn't Proverbs say, don't answer a fool according to his folly? So often, some of these guys who make statements, I would like to send an email and just give them some of their own stuff back. But Proverbs says, a soft answer turns away wrath. Grievous words stir up anger. So maybe we ought to use more soft answers and be a little more winsome in our approach to dealing with this stuff. Okay, so let's look at some of these that are mentioned in the book here. Oh, on page 516 it talks about the scale and the mode of response. Okay, the scale would be, wasn't there some kind of international meeting to address global warming? Or no, to address, was there an international meeting to address pollution in the air from industrialized countries?
I assume yes.
There was. And guess what? Here's what happened. the industrialized countries, remember how when we talked about the coal being turned into electricity, how they've put new scrubbers on there if you read those articles, and we don't pollute like we used to? Okay, it's like old established industrialized countries are telling the new young industrialized countries, you need to build plants with these scrubbers and things to start with. And they're saying, hey, we're a poor country. We're just getting started. We're only doing what you did when you got started. If you want us to spend money to keep the air clean, you send the money over here to keep it clean, because we're going to use our money to build our country's path to economic growth. You follow the thinking? And the developing countries are saying, don't tell us how to keep the air pure. You did your share of pollution, and now it's our turn. And once we become as rich and prosperous as you are, then we'll do it your way. Does this surprise you? There's been some global meetings on global warming and what's happening to the sea level. Did you know there are some islands that are on the verge of disappearing? The sea level has risen enough. They were already flat islands anyway. The highest point on the island was maybe no more than 10 feet above sea level. So once the sea levels start to rise, the whole island is underwater. And those people say, we have to do something about sea level rise. And it seems like, we're probably not going to solve the sea level rise problem. We probably need to figure out a way to help those countries pack up and move someplace else. And it might be that we need to provide some ways to help them do that. Actually, off the coast of Louisiana, there's an island that's just about to be lost. And some people have insisted that my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents all lived on this island, so I'm going to stay here too. And I figured out a way how to build my house on stilts. So he'll just tie up a boat, and he'll build his house up above the water. So he still lives on his island, it's just his island's covered with water. And it's like, well, you can't have a garden anymore, doesn't matter. All the other people on the island have moved to the mainland, and there's a little spot there that belongs to me. I go over there and plant a garden, then I put the produce in my boat and haul it back to my little house on stilts, because this is where I want to live. Probably his grandkids are probably not going to keep that up, are they? They're going to say, Grandpa, it's time to move to the mainland. Did you know there was a town here in Missouri that lived at the place where two rivers met, and every time we had a big rain it would flood this town? And finally the people in town said, it's time for us to move, and they picked up the whole city and moved it up on top of a hill, and even built a main street that looked like the old main street they had down in the river bottoms, so they could have their own little city high and dry the next time it storms. And every time it rains and floods, people from that town like to drive down, look over at the flooded area and smile and say, yep, doesn't bother us anymore because we built our city up on a hill. And sometimes on national scales, on global scales, they're talking about what to do about this kind of stuff. And obviously there are disagreements. And where people have some agreements, sometimes people sign and agree to do things, and then they don't all follow through. And the consequence is that some people just say, forget it. And others say, no, we have to keep working at it. But on page 517, it shows a picture of what heavy industry is doing in Germany and China. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. An abandoned steel mill in Germany on the left, and a steel mill in China. That's why the one on the left isn't polluting. It's not running anymore. And can you see what the Chinese are saying? Hey, you people, we're a poor country trying to industrialize. We're just going to live with this pollution. And pollution is a serious problem in China. But I just read this on the internet doing research for this chapter. The pollutants in China are so severe that they're actually blowing across the ocean and coming to California. So California is suffering from this pollution that you're seeing this picture of on page 517. So there's another picture of China on page 518. And I guess people who live in China are really having a difficult time living with all this pollution. So who's using some energy efficiency trends? Who's in the process of trying to do things to improve the quality of life? And what does it say? What's that picture show at the top of page 519? Which countries have little green dots? Particulate matter concentrations in urban areas.
Spain.
South Africa. The dark green dots.
A few in Russia.
Australia, a few in Russia.
Russia.
Norway, Sweden,
America.
France. Is that Ireland? So what about the bright red dots? More than 80 particulate matters per cubic meter. See where China is really, and China and India are really, and here again, we're trying to tell China and India that you ought to be more like us, and they're saying we are like you were 50 years ago. And in 50 years, we'll clean our act up too, once we're as prosperous as you are. And the people in America say, no, we want to take care of it faster than that. If we really are that concerned about pollutants, don't you think we ought to set the pace and be role models for the rest of the world? And if we're going to tell India that you pollute too much, so what size home does the average Indian person live in? Have any of you seen pictures of homes in India? Did I tell you about my missionary friend? Spent his life as a missionary in India. When he retired, he moved back here, and he moved to Wichita. And he asked me to come down and visit. He said, my wife wants you guys to come down and visit and see our new house. It's just amazing, this big house the Lord has provided. And what it was a tiny little cottage in the old part of Wichita, Kansas. Like, you know, in Old Town Belton, those little houses, it was one of those little houses. And he was talking about how spacious it was. And I thought, well, it's a good thing he doesn't come to Kansas City and see where I live. Because he would say, you are obviously not doing your part to keep the air clean in America. Yes, I am. I have an all-electric home. No, you're not. It takes a truckload of coal every day just to keep your house going with all that electricity. But because he lived in India, where he was used to tiny little homes, when he came back here, he bought a tiny little home. Any of you interested in building a tiny little home? Have you seen any pictures of tiny little homes? Before class started, I said, so what are some of your plans for your path to economic growth? Do any of you have kind of a plan as to what kind of house you want to live in when you eventually own a home? Is it like a 1-bedroom house, or is it a 3-bedroom house, or is it a 5-bedroom house? Does it have 1 bathroom or 3 bathrooms? What?
I haven't put that much thought into it.
So, what's it going to be? Are you going to have a brand new home built that requires cutting down some new trees? Or will you go buy an older home that's already built where it doesn't cost any more to move in? And what kind of car are you going to drive? Are you going to get an all-electric car?
Toyota.
What?
A Toyota?
A Toyota? Yeah, I'm going to drive one of those because it doesn't burn much. But an all-electric car just wouldn't work for me. I have to go to Oklahoma to visit my family. And the all-electric car would run out of electricity about halfway down there. So maybe I need to have two cars. One car for making trips that I hardly ever drive, and another car for driving to school every day. You know, I'm thinking, if I really wanted to save energy, why buy an electric car? Why not just start riding a bicycle or a little motor scooter? Have you ever seen these little scooters? Anybody on campus have one of those little scooters that they get about 35 miles, or 30, they're as fast as about 35 miles per hour?
You mean a moped?
Yeah, give me a moped. What would happen if I just said, I'm going to pull my moped in up here and park it someplace?
That would be funny.
What?
Be really funny.
But wouldn't it save energy?
Yeah.
So, you see, here in America, I'm not sure all of us, myself included, are ready to do our part to cut back on global pollution, or to do our part to improve the air quality and the quality of life around the world, to address these problems. Because we like having, I'm sorry, but in the wintertime, I like to walk around in stocking feet in a living room with a big vaulted ceiling, and that just takes a whole bunch of electricity to heat all that space up. But I'm just comfortable with it. And if you look at houses, the new houses that are being built today are bigger and bigger and bigger, and you might make a decision to say, you know, I'm going to do my part by buying a smaller house down the road. And I'm doing my part by buying a house that's big enough for another family to live with me. So I moved my daughter and son-in-law and her family in upstairs, and I moved to the basement to where eventually I get to live there for free and they pay all the bills. And they're around to take care of me when I get old. What kind of deal is that? So I am doing my part, because that way, instead of two homes, it's one home with two families in it. Page 520 talks about pollution and the quality of life. Oh, what are they doing in California? They're putting restrictions on cars and trying to pass laws that we do away with gas-powered automobiles out here. I don't know how quick that'll happen, but they're saying, let's try to eliminate some of this pollution. What did I say? Of all the states in the United States, which one has the highest pollution?
California.
California has the highest air pollution. So it'd be interesting to watch to see what they do about it out there and how they address that. But, now here again, the rich and famous keep talking to the rest of us about how we ought to not pollute so much, and then we see pictures of their houses where they live, and I'm thinking, that's not a house, that's a whole community. That's way too much home, no matter how rich you are. So maybe, again, it's just the idea of, I hear a lot of talk about what other people ought to be doing. And it's like, no, let's talk about what we can be doing, what I can be doing. If the tomatoes I buy at the grocery store are flown in here from Mexico and Canada, and I don't want to contribute to that pollution effort, all I have to do is start growing tomatoes at my house. Say, yeah, but you can only grow tomatoes in the summertime. Can you? Can you grow tomatoes in the wintertime if you grow them in a hot house? You don't know. Yes, you can. Well, then the next question is, so do you grow your own tomatoes? No. It's just too much work. The pollution's not bad enough for me to do something about it yet. You follow? What are we doing about it? And okay, I am driving a little car that gets 40 miles a gallon. That's my contribution. What else do I do? Oh, I have my own septic system so I don't put pollutants into the river like the rest of the city does. You go, where do your pollutants go? They go through a septic tank, through a long pipe, into a big lagoon where the wild animals love it because the microbes take care of all of the purification process that they have to do down at the river before they put the water back in the river. What else am I doing? Oh, when I moved in, it was like a house on a hill, and I said, Nina, there are no trees around here. So we started planting trees, and since we've lived there about 18 years, we've got trees everywhere. And now people come to our house, and they sit outside, and they go, boy, the air is so fresh out here. Well, it's because we're sitting surrounded by a whole bunch of trees that are just oozing out oxygen and sucking up carbon dioxide so fast, it makes for a wonderful, pleasant place just to sit outside and breathe fresh air. And because we're up on a hill and out in an area where there's only 150 families on our square mile, we get a nice cool breeze that comes blowing across all this grassland to make it comfortable. So we don't have to run our air conditioner quite as much as other people do. Ah, you have an air conditioner? Yes. Why don't you turn it off so you won't use as much electricity? I'm not ready to go that far.
Yeah.
But who needs air conditioning? How many of you ever lived without air conditioning? Okay, can we live without it?
Yeah. It's hard.
We just have to learn to sweat and make that an acceptable part of our culture. But again, see, it's like, no, we're not ready to do that. I even said one time at church, maybe we ought to think about, I think we were having a discussion about whether or not we could spend money for some youth group activity that was kind of like a missions trip. And somebody suggested they weren't sure we had money for that. And I said, why don't we turn off the air conditioning for a couple of Sundays and take the money we save and use that for the missions trip for the teenagers? And that wasn't a well-received idea. I was just saying, I'm just thinking of alternatives, people. And they said, turning off the air conditioning is not an alternative. And I thought, boy, do I live in the midst of a bunch of people who have never tasted living without air conditioning. And I remember doing it. And no, I do not want to go back and do it again. But could I do it if I needed to? Yes. Page 521 talks about water. Wastewater treatment in Israel, where there's not much rain. And most of you understand where our water comes from and how after we use it, it runs through the drains, it goes back into pipes and goes back downtown to the sewage treatment plant where they treat it and then put it back into the river for the next people to use downstream. But is good quality drinking water a serious global challenge in the world today? Are there people in the world today who don't have good, clean drinking water every day of their lives? And do you know what happens to those people? They experience all kinds of waterborne diseases. Is there anything we can do about that? Yes. Now, what continent do you think has the greatest number of people suffering from waterborne diseases and suffering from a lack of clean water to drink and cook with? Any idea which countries? Africa. Does anyone know what some mission organizations have done? And some charitable organizations? And some scientific organizations? And even people like Bill Gates. They've gone to Africa and said, whoa, look at all of these waterborne diseases. If we could just clean up the water these people drink, we could save a lot of health problems and a lot of lives. So guess what they're doing in Africa? Does anyone know what some of these people are doing? Just Google drilling wells for fresh water in Africa. Yes?
Sometimes that actually hurts them more than helps them, because in one of the cultures that people did that, the women would always go a couple miles away to a river with the children, do all their chores, whereas the men stayed home and worked in the fields. Well, when they built the well, the women no longer had to go away, so they didn't know how to live with each other, and it caused a lot of war and broken families and trouble. So a lot of the times when people from America try and go help, they don't learn the culture first and they try and help, and it actually hurts way more than it actually helps.
And does the pure water hurt, or does the fact that people can't learn how to live together?
It's more of they have to learn how to live a different way than they've always lived.
And if they're not, what, do they want to keep drinking dirty water from the river?
It's all they've ever known.
So do we just let them keep drinking dirty water? Or do we say, you know, based on what's happened in some countries, when we drill this well, it's going to cause families to have problems and people are going to get lazy? And they say, that won't happen at our village. And you know what? If I was out there with a well drilling equipment and had the money to do it, and someone said, in fact, my brother said to me one time, who worked for an oil company overseas, why do American missionaries come to these countries and mess with their culture by introducing their new belief system? And I said, hey Richard, why do your oil companies come to these countries and tap their oil reserves and mess with their culture by putting all the people on the oil field payroll? He goes, well, that's different. I'm going, no, we're both messing with the culture. The question is the difference I'm making going to, over the long haul, benefit them, or is it going to hurt them? And if I say, here's a group of people who are drinking river water that's full of waterborne diseases, and if the average lifespan is 30 years, and they happen to be in a place where we can drill a well, they can get clean water to where they can start living for 50 years. I'm thinking that what we're doing, even with the bad side effects, is more beneficial to the big picture for the children.
Well, the only problem with that is when that happens, a lot of people then develop bad views on America. And when missionaries come over to try and teach them about Jesus, it causes them to be thrown out because they're like, you did this to us, we don't want you in.
And see, if they said, the guy who drilled the well did this to us, I would have to look that guy right in the face and say, no, the well didn't do that to you. You did it to yourselves because you couldn't adjust to drinking clean water and being healthier. You just had to insist on being your old, ugly, depraved self and messed up a good thing. You took a good thing and didn't use it to its best advantage. And again, blame America. I mean, you go places where oil companies have drilled wells and made a country rich. Well, let's see. While they were doing that, they also built this refinery that polluted the air. Now, what are those countries doing that were made rich by that oil well? Blaming America for polluting our air. If you want to blame America for your problems, you can probably find a reason to blame America. If you want to take ownership of your own problems, you can probably find a reason to say, yep, we did it to ourselves. What have we done to ourselves in America that's probably shocking to people who lived in this country 50 years ago, 100 years ago. You don't know what we do today in America? They just passed a law in some state that if you can hear a heartbeat, I think it was Alabama, if you can hear a heartbeat, you cannot abort the child. And the media is all worked up about that. What are they doing to a woman's right? A woman's right to what?
Kill.
To terminate the heartbeat of the baby that's growing in her? But she doesn't want that child. Well, then give it up for adoption. Well, she doesn't want to do that either. So, what? She's going to kill the baby so nobody else can have it? What are we thinking in this country? I mean, watch. You know what? If it hadn't have been for the medical profession developing ways to abort babies, so it's the medical profession's fault that we have so many abortions. No, it isn't. No. It's just the depraved heart of man that says, I want to live the way I want to live, and I don't want to be held personally accountable for the choices I've made. Americans have gone to Iraq and taught people who used to raise poppies to make drugs and taught them how to raise wheat to feed their families and their communities. And guess what happened after the American advisors left? They quit raising wheat and went back to raising poppies. So now they're all hungry again, but they have more cash because the poppies make more money. I'm thinking that we just have to say, you made the choice, you suffer the consequences. You do the crime, what? You do the time. You make the choice, you suffer the consequences. Okay, we're going to finish chapter 13 tomorrow. On Friday, and then keep those assignments coming in.
So, on the